In my last video, I talked a little bit about the F-16, but really only from the context of the Hawks seeing this as their next HIMAR. The Hawks love to bandwagon on stuff, and this is kind of the next big thing for them. Which is why I'm making this video, because, like I said, Hawks will bandwagon an idea or piece of equipment until people will just scream at them to shut up. Of course, things that have worked out for them are Javelin and In-Law, HIMAR being another good example that's maybe a little bit more analogous to the F-16. But, I mean, there were points where you would have daytime TV people who were hawkish, saying no fly zone at least once a broadcast for a month or two. So, they're not necessarily hitting all of them out of the park, but typically they jump on a bandwagon after seeing some kind of post from the Ukrainians, like St. In-Law and St. Javelin, and just saying these are the best pieces of equipment ever. That's kind of what they're trying to do with the F-16, but at least here in the US, no one ever talks about other aircraft, and there are a lot of exported aircraft. The US is probably the dominant one in this market, and we maybe kind of muscle a couple of people out, unfortunately. But there are a lot of countries that export very reliable, very capable fighter craft that would be comparable to an extent to the F-16. But no one ever brings it up. Maybe in Sweden, people talk about the Gripen. Maybe in the UK, people are talking about the Eurofighter. But for the most part, all I ever hear here is the F-16. And as cool as the F-16 is, a single type of plane, even with it being multi-role, doesn't replace all of Ukraine's Air Force. It's a cool, capable, fairly inexpensive jet, by comparison at least, but it's not necessarily going to fill every combat role they have. Which leads me to what I'm going to be actually talking about in this video. So I've I've started this video in at least recordings maybe 12 to 15 times, and I got through it almost all the way once before fixing it a little bit, because it went 2 hours and I was only about 3/4 the way through. So needless to say, this is getting split up. The first part, which you're watching now, is going to cover the pre-war and current Ukrainian Air Forces with some of the F-16 stuff. So pre-war inventory of the Ukrainian Air Force, the aircraft specs of what they had, or currently have still, the losses they've suffered so far, the enemy air threats, the anti-air threats, so the ground-based anti-air stuff. Then that'll lead into the doctrines. What are the needs of Ukraine, and what kind of paths should they go down, which will lead us into the F-16 as far as an introduction goes, with some history, some specs, and a couple of the major variants. Part 2 is going to be kind of the F-16 versus the world, where we look at some of the other aircraft options, both new and used, because there's a large variety out there that might be a little bit better in some ways, not necessarily all of them. Then we'll take a look at what options might work out a little bit better. I've got some individual aircraft picked out in there too for spec comparisons. Then I want to talk about drones and how those might impact this decision. And then, of course, the fun part of it all with politics, kind of rounding the whole discussion out as to whether or not this is maybe even possible in the current US political climate in the US. But without further ado, let's take a look at the Ukrainian Air Force pre-war, and this is all they have in terms of combat craft. There's a bunch of other auxiliary and support craft, reconnaissance craft that aren't included here, but for actual combat missions, this is what they've got. Please note that these also include anything that's mid-upgrade or has been upgraded, because there are several different unique Ukrainian variants of these aircraft, as well as any trainer craft that may not be used in combat. Some of them may, some of them won't, but generally these are the numbers we're looking at. So we have 12 Su-24 fencers. These are kind of deep strike craft, kind of analogous to the US F-111 aardvarks. Then you have the 35 Su-25s. Those are analogous to the A-10. They're close air support craft. You have 51 Mig-29s, which are kind of the F-16 of the Russian world, if you will. Similar type of fighter craft. And then 32 of the Su-27 air superiority fighters, which would be kind of like the F-15. So you have a pretty good balance in terms of ground attack and air-to-air. Of course, you have a lot more air-to-air, but some of the capabilities of the MiG and the Su-27 allow them to do some of the ground combat stuff as well. The Su-24 Fencer M/MR variant is the Ukrainian upgrade version of this, so it is unique just to them. There you can see some of the weights and stuff like that. This is really just to kind of give you an idea of how heavy some of these craft are, because usually people will try to equate heaviness to maneuverability, and in a lot of instances that's pretty applicable, but there's a few where it's not so much. This can carry quite a bit in terms of its payload, in terms of external fuel tanks, standoff munitions, things like that. Like I said, this is a deep strike craft, so it's going to fly real low level with its terrain-following radar, go real fast, throw out its munitions, which in some instances are standoff munitions or rockets or guided or unguided bombs, and then try to fly out of there as fast as possible. With the service ceiling of around 36,000 feet, this was not a high-flying craft. This is not a strategic bomber by any means. This is not an air superiority fighter. This was meant to stay low to the ground, comparatively, drop its munitions, and just go real fast. Now, looking at those speeds, you would think, oh, well, that's really not that fast. I mean, it's only Mach 1.35, which is fast. But, I mean, you had things like, in this kind of a time frame, the F-4 Phantom was stepping out over Mach 2. I believe the Foxbat, the Mig-29, I think, was also over Mach 2. The Tomcat was over Mach 2, I think. So you had a couple of aircraft around this era that were faster, but none of those were really flying low. That's a very difficult thing to do, but that ground-following radar made that a lot easier. It did carry a couple of different things, like the KH-58 anti-radiation missile, which is kind of like the American HARM, but from my understanding, not necessarily as effective. Just maybe not from a technological standpoint, somewhat so, but also from a training standpoint. This was not ever really a big deal doctrine-wise for the Russians. Then you also have the KH-29 air-to-surface missile. This is kind of like the Maverick in a little bit of a way. You had some air defense missiles it could also house. Wasn't very maneuverable, so you were kind of hoping you never had to use those. Then a variety of guided and unguided bombs. And it's got an effective range, which might include external fuel tanks, I'm not 100% sure on this, of 652 miles, which is, for a deep strike craft, makes a lot of sense. But it is a pretty big distance, especially compared to some of the other craft we'll look at today. Then you have the Su-25 M1 UBM-1 Frogfoot. You've got it being quite a bit lighter, comparatively speaking. Its service ceiling being lower, about 23,000 feet. And like I said, this is the A-10, so it's slow, but it's real tough. It's not going to go fast, but it can take a beating. It's very simple, very straightforward ground attack aircraft. So a lot of times it's going to be bombs and rockets. Sometimes you would have some standoff capability, say like the KH-29. But generally speaking, this is kind of your rocket hauler. That's not going to be a helicopter. It's got a combat radius a little bit less, but still fairly impressive for its size. Once again, could possibly consider maybe fuel tanks. Some of these metrics were a little hard to discern. I don't know if that's just base internal fuel tanks or if that's including additional. Probably just internal. The A-10 also has a long loiter time, which can kind of affect combat radius as well. And then a service life here, largely because I want to kind of take a look at that a little bit later on. But service life is kind of important and changes depending on what upgrade package and stuff you're looking at. Just to give you kind of an idea, when you're looking at something that has like 8,000 hours, you're usually looking like 15, maybe 20 years, depending on the country. sometimes it could be 10, because it really depends on how often an Air Force can afford to fly things. So, an instance, Russia, one of their big problems they've had for a long time, with their Air Force in particular, is being able to actually afford to do all of their mandatory flight training hours. Part of that is some of the pilot capacity they have. Some of it is just pure monetary issues. Some of the planes don't work. But generally speaking, the less you fly that, the less experienced your pilots are going to be, but the more lifetime you have on the aircraft. So it's a little bit of a balancing out act there. Then you have the Mig-29 Mu-1 Mu-2 Fulcrum. As you can see, kind of getting a little bit closer back up to the Fencer in terms of weight. Much higher service ceiling, about 60,000 feet. That's not where it's typically going to be working and doing most of its combat missions, but it can get up there. It goes pretty fast. Mach 2.3. It's really kicking it up there. I will also apologize. I realized while looking at this that I think just the Fencer is in kilometers per hour, so that throws that metric off, but all the Mach speeds are generally going to be the same, so you have a better idea there. A very fast, very agile craft, combat radius of about 531 miles, and a service life of about 4,000 hours. So this is kind of a unique craft because while it is kind of the direct comparison to the F-16 in terms of a role, it kind of has a different role just because the U.S. didn't really have this particular need. They fill a very similar role in like a frontline air-to-air fighter, but the Fulcrum was initially designed to operate from improvised runways as the Soviet army moved west across Europe. So, if you captured an airfield or even a highway and you had a forward operating base, you could land, refuel, rearm, and take back off. So you generally kind of had the idea that these were somewhat always going to be in the air. And they would have a pretty solid assortment of weapons with the Aphid, the Alamo, the Archer, so they had beyond visual range capability. They have the Iris-T or the IR camera on them. So they didn't even necessarily need to turn the radars on to find you. They would have the IR camera that could track you and wouldn't give you a radar missile warning because it's not tracking you via radar. It's a passive tracking system. This would also be the type of aircraft that is currently fielding the AGM-88 HARM missile. So this is the high-speed anti-radiation missile that the Ukrainians have been using to shoot at Russian SAM sites. Which has been a big help for them trying to be a little bit more active in the air, but also make the air slightly less contested from their side. The MU-2, which if I'm correct, only 1 to maybe 2 units have been upgraded to this, also has some ground attack capability. But generally speaking, well, this is kind of a multi-role fighter. It was initially designed just to do kind of your close-range, frontline, air-to-air stuff. Which leads us to the Su-27, PM-1, SP-1M, and UB-1M flanker. It's much heavier than pretty much everything else. It's also fairly large. This is a big aircraft, and we'll see in a moment the Russians really like this type of airframe. Service ceiling a little bit higher at 62,000 feet, Mach 2.35, so just a little bit faster. Combat radius of 800 miles, which, once again, I think that's including external fuel tanks, but I could be wrong. These are much larger craft than a lot of their American counterparts, so they may have more internal fuel there. And a service life of about 8,000 hours, which, for like something like a U.S. aircraft, is usually 10 to 15 years. Russian and Ukrainian, if they're not flying it as much, may be a little bit longer. But those 3 variants are all of the specific Ukrainian ones. This is their air superiority fighter, like I said, kind of the F-15 here. They have the Alamo, which is their IR-guided missile. So once again, it has that little camera on the front. They also have the Archer, which is a semi-active radar beyond visual range missile. So you do still have to guide it onto target. It's not like the AMRAAM Ds or anything like that now, or even the adders that the Russians have, where it's fully active radar. It has its own built-in radar on the missile, but it is semi-active, so it kind of relays from the aircraft, and once it gets to a certain point, it kind of starts tracking on its own, but you have to track it in a real good ways. But yeah, so these are the air superiority fighters. These would be the ones really securing air dominance if that was a big thing at this part in the war. Now, let's take a look at losses, because I think this is a fairly, of course, it's a very grim thing to talk about, but it is odd the way these numbers are spread out. So your Su-24, your deep strike craft, which pretty much could go one end of the country to the other for the most part, fairly equally distributed in terms of their downs. So they're usually based out of Western Air Command, the 204th and the 7th Aviation Tactical Aviation Brigades. 3 of them were downed there. I do believe most of those were shot down on the ground. A lot of these were going to be downed on the ground. We'll see it much more with the MiG-29. But these in particular have a little bit more of a problem. The idea, and the Su-25 and the A-10 also kind of run into this, but a large part of why the U.S. Stopped using the F-111 while it was fairly capable, the idea of flying low to the ground to avoid SAMs, not necessarily technically wrong, but doesn't get you out of the way of manpads or any radar or unguided or direct fire anti-aircraft guns like the Shilkas. Yeah, it's not going to be good. Those can still hit you, and the closer you are to the ground, the more likely they are to hit you. Part of the reason why the F-111 started flying higher missions, and then we were just like, well, we have other aircraft that fly this way. Why do we need this? Especially having variable swept wings, which this also has. So this is much more expensive and much more of a headache to maintain. But 3 were shot down or destroyed in the Western Air Command, 3 in the Central region, 3 in the Eastern region, and 1 in the Southern region. This is pretty much the only one that has any significant number of downs in the Eastern Theater, which is kind of surprising. There's also 2 that are unknown as to where their locations were, so they may have one still active. They may have also been able to cobble together another one or so from some of the parts and airframes they'd gotten earlier in the war. But generally speaking, this is a craft that has suffered pretty greatly, and its mission profile is just not working super well for this particular conflict. That brings us to the Su-25, the real big heavy boy that's not moving very fast. As you can see, not nearly as equally distributed. So I will say the 299th, I believe, suffered some aircraft destroyed on the ground as well. But 1 in the Western Air Command, 1 in the Central, 2 in the East, and 6 in the Southern Air Command where it's based. Yeah, this makes total sense. You've seen a lot of videos of these flying around, flying low, very dangerous missions. You're maybe flying under like the medium to long range SAMNet, but the short range, but typically your manpads and your direct fire AA guns are going to do a fair bit of damage. Now, one thing is the Su-25 has over the Su-24 is it can take a hit. There have been videos of multiple different countries Su-25s taking like a manpad to like the tail or the engine or part of the wing and still being able to fly it home. Like, they are very tough aircraft for this reason, just like the A-10. But you still run a very high risk of being a high casualty aircraft for what you're doing, flying so low and the area being so littered with your shorter range anti-aircraft weapons. 10 of these were lost, 25 of them remain. I imagine we will continue to see these very active in the Southern Air Command as we see the continuation of the counteroffensive in the Kherson region. The Mig-29, this one suffered some pretty heavy losses. probably the most distributed in terms of their actual air wings, or aviation brigades, I should say. I do know that the Western Command, I believe maybe all 6 of those were destroyed by cruise missile at the beginning of the war for the 114th. And then 4 of the 9 in the Central Air Command were destroyed on the ground. So not all of these are air-to-air kills. Some of these were destroyed before even being able to take off. They were just destroyed on the ground, early stages of the war. But you have the 114th there in the west, the 40th there in the Central Air Command, no missions being flown over the east, as you'd expect, and then the 204th down there in the south, which, once again, the possibility of those being ground losses, but I think those were air-to-air losses. And then you have 2 that they're not really sure. I will say here that this is the most kind of heavily implied that, well, they've lost 20. All of those parts and airframes and stuff that they had gotten a couple months back from like the U.S. and some of the Eastern European countries there would kind of facilitate them bringing 20 other MiG-29s back into service, roughly. So this kind of balances back out. They still have a very sizable force of these. They're still very capable for the type of air war that's being fought right now. Which brings us to the Su-27, which kind of explains the crux of this war. So, Western Air Command, nothing was destroyed there because none of them were based there. The 2 that were lost in the Central Air Command, I believe, were both air-to-air losses. I take that back. I think one might have been on the ground. You have the 39th Tactical Aviation Brigade and the 831st. 1 lost in the east, 1 lost in the south. Both of those, if I'm correct, were air-to-air kills. So you have 4 lost, but 28 remaining, and that is very indicative of the contested airspace and no motivation, movement really from either side to really heavily establish air dominance and air superiority, because the anti-air systems on both sides are still active and incredibly effective. It's many videos are out there of like S-400s or S-300s not picking up on certain aircraft like drones. They're still effective for large aircraft like these because don't be mistaken, the radar cross-section of all these Russian planes is very large by comparison to the West. So it's much, much easier for the Russians to pick these up. And for something like this that is typically fairly high-flying and doing combat air patrols, they would be prime pickings for those kind of air defenses. Which brings us to the enemy air threats. As you can see, the Russians love that Su-27 style airframe there. You've got the Su-35S, the 97 units of that, air superiority fighters. The Su-34, 125 units of that, kind of taking the place of the Su-24 with your kind of strike and air, your strike and ground attack type craft. The Su-30, which is kind of the upgraded version of, I think, the Su-33, which is the naval version of the flanker. They have 110 units of those. The Su-27, of course, 101 units of those. As you see, they have a lot of these air superiority fighters and not a lot of ways to use them at the moment. The Su-24, 273 of those. These are upgraded but still fairly legacy aircraft. The Su-27, or Su-57, sorry, they have 3 units of these, and we will probably not see these at any point in the war. And if we do, it's probably because they're captured on the ground, which is very unlikely because these are probably not leaving anywhere that's safe. These are very new, expensive aircraft. Russia does not want to attempt to lose them. You also have the MiG-31 interceptors. You have 90 of those, and these have primarily been used for standoff munitions. So the hypersonic missiles that the Russians field, as well as some of the air-launched cruise missiles. That's kind of really the only way we've seen them. You have 87 units of the Mig-29. Of course, this is the Russian upgraded variant. And then the MiG-35, which is 6 units of those, which is kind of the new version of the MiG-29 with some more modern systems and things like that. But once again, much like the Su-57, we're not going to see these anytime soon for the most part. Now, what do the Russians have on the ground? Because this is probably the most problematic portion of an air war. They have a lot. The Russians decided not to try to necessarily match the Western forces, NATO, the US, in terms of direct air-to-air capability, but more so to just stop them from flying at all. So not only is the S-100 series very capable and used by a lot of countries, including Ukraine, they also have the Pantsir, the Buk, the Tor, the Tunguska, the Strelas, the Osa, and the Shilkas. So they have a lot of variation in terms of short, medium, and long-range SAMs. They have kind of they have their own man-pad variants. They have radar-guided and direct-fire AA guns. They have a lot. And those direct-fire AA guns can also fire on other things, like infantry fighting vehicles or infantry, and they're very deadly. So this kind of being on both sides of the front has really stopped the air war from being all that crazy. No side's really going to establish air dominance, or even try, honestly, because one things the Soviets weren't really too bothered by was doing SEAD or DEAD missions, suppression or destruction of enemy air defense. So this was not a big training portion for either the Soviets or the Russians, or by extension, the Ukrainians. Now, they've adapted the harm very well, and if they've used it to successful ends on several different occasions that we've seen, but still, the Russians have got a backlog of these from, the last 40 to 50 years for some of the more capable things. I mean, even their older stuff, like S2 and 300s, are still very capable. But, of course, their newer stuff is a little bit more scary. Which leads us to Doctrine. So we know what the Ukrainians had, what they have, and what they're going up against. So there are two big doctrines I wanted to talk about. The first one, which is what I think everyone that listens to the daytime TV show Hawks talk about, are kind of assuming is going to be this. The kind of parity with Russia or the NATO-style Air Force. They're going to try to be real new in terms of air-to-air capabilities, really pushing beyond visual range combat. So kind of the stuff we have with AMRAAM and some of the other missiles we're working on for even longer range stuff. The like AIM-9X stuff, which is not necessarily BVR in some instances, but high off-bore sight stuff that the Russians have been doing for a while. Advanced data link, so you would kind of also need some pretty significant AWACS or any kind of other aircraft with data link. Even ground sites can kind of tap into this as well. Varied, accurate, and advanced GPS systems, not only for tracking, but this also kind of helps the missiles. Their INS, their inertial navigation systems, aren't necessarily the most accurate either. More combat air patrols and full air superiority, like we would have seen with Desert Storm or Iraq. In terms of ground, you would need to have that air superiority so that things like the A-10 or the F-16s with ground munitions could swing through and hit their targets. You would want some standoff munitions, longer range capabilities, guided things, even stuff to make like unguided rockets and bombs guided munitions. That's a capability we have. But you don't want a lot of like really in-your-face, close air support type stuff. Because even the A-10 in Iraq was not largely used in a super close combat role for a lot of reasons that maybe I'll talk about in the second part of this video. But generally speaking, the longer range capability you have, typically the better off it goes for you. GPS, once again, is also very important, something the Russians have had some difficulty with since they got cut off from the US and French-based GPS systems. Then, of course, your guided and unguided rockets and bombs, and a variety of those in terms of what size, what yield, and generally just kind of what mission. because some of them have other types, whether it's anti-personnel, anti-structure, anti-vehicle, whatever it may be. Your anti-ship capability, deep strike capability is very important. Time on attack is also super important for anti-ship ops. So you would need a fair few aircraft, or at least a couple of aircraft that can field a lot of these missiles at once to fire. And then anti-sub operations, which is not necessarily as much of an aircraft situation as it is a helicopter situation, which is not something we're talking about, but that's another fairly important thing in terms of a NATO-style air force or naval aviation force that you would look into. And then, of course, air refueling for longer on-station missions and your more advanced radar AWACS systems. Now, this is a great, fun idea. The problem is it's not super realistic in the short term or even kind of the midterm. This is something we may be looking 15 to 20 years, maybe post-war, that's capable, possibly. And when I say that, I don't mean 15 to 20 years from now. I mean 15 to 20 after the war has ended, and probably after Ukraine's economy has kind of balanced itself back out. Something that is being implemented more so now that kind of was just a fun coincidence, I guess, that I was kind of writing this as this came out. What I like to term is either the anti-Russian, so the aircraft or the Air Force is designed just to counter the Russian capabilities, the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars, or as the U.S. Central Command has termed it, the Resistance Doctrine. This was something that kind of came out in, I think, an interview not too long ago, maybe a couple of days ago at the point of the writing of this, that the U.S. had been working with the Ukrainians after the wars in 2014 had started on if the Russians invaded, this is the doctrine you should follow, at least at first. And they call it the Resistance Doctrine, which makes a lot of sense. So in terms of air-to-air threats or air-to-air capabilities, your real-time intelligence is super important. Now, for the Ukrainians, this is a little more difficult, but they do have help from the U.S. and the U.K. AWACS systems that are constantly flying the border. The U.S. has had reconnaissance drones in the area, not, of course, over Ukraine, but flying through the Black Sea and stuff like that, to kind of give them an idea of what the southern portion of the country is looking like, which is going to lead you to air interdiction. You want limited but rapid sorties for this, which is stuff like the Mig-29 would be doing. You want to get your fighters up real quick, fire the missiles, and come back. You don't want them up in the air a long time, because you don't want the Russians to either send more craft to attack you, or those craft to get shot down by enemy air defenses. The longer you're up, the longer you get drawn into a fight, the higher it's probably going to go, the more likely you're going to fall into enemy air defenses. You would want to do the other side to them. Ideally, fire a missile at them, kind of get them to turn cold or away from the fight, have them re-engage, maybe follow you back, and they get caught up in your air defenses. So you really want to rely on your ground air defense more than combat air patrols. The airspace being shut down for the most part is fairly beneficial to Ukraine. And I know that seems kind of callous to say that because, ballistic missiles are still coming in. But the fewer Russian aircraft that are in the air, even at the expense of Ukrainian aircraft being in the air, is really kind of balancing more things out. The less the Russians can express their air advantage in technology, the better it is for the Ukrainians. And you want to just set traps with your AA and SAM sites. And this is something they've been kind of doing. Without the number of integrated air defense systems that the Russians have, the Ukrainians have had to be really smart and very mobile with where they're placing these. So they've kind of moved them around, placed them in the most advantageous places they could on the fronts to really make sure that there is nothing in the air, or what is in the air is very, very, very limited. So you have a couple of different things to be kind of considering there. But generally, in terms of air-to-air, if you have anything there, it's not a combat air patrol, it's limited air interdiction missions. In terms of ground attack, you want to be very coordinated with your ground attacks. Once again, this kind of goes back to real-time intel, whether it's coming through a drone or kind of being relayed through a couple of different people. The closer you can get to that, the more accurate and the quicker you can get in and out of that mission. Timing this with artillery attacks across a wider line is also very beneficial, because one thing that the Ukrainians have been using to great effect have been like those M777s and the HIMARS and the M270s. The problem is they don't have enough of them. The Russians have a still huge margin over them in terms of the ability to field artillery and just fire shells. Whether or not those shells are accurate, it's really not all that important to the Russians. They just want to fire them in the direction the enemy is. So in order to kind of counterbalance that, combining air attack with artillery and MLRS type stuff really helps you get a full field of fire for effect across a wider swath of the front. Now, of course, you don't want to do it across the whole front, but in limited means, like they're kind of doing in the counteroffensive in Kherson right now, would be very beneficial to kind of making up that deficit in terms of artillery fire. And then once again, quick, accurate, short fire missions. You don't want these aircraft to be in the air that long. Loiter times in this type of war are really not going to be that beneficial, because while the Ukrainians probably have the edge in number of man pads distributed throughout the field, the Russians still have a lot of man pads and short-range SAMs and direct-fire AA that are still very dangerous to things like the Su-25. So do not stay in the air too long is really the idea. It's once again, it's kind of the rebel hit-and-fade tactic. Hit your mission, get out of there. You don't need to stay and get into a protracted fight. For anti-shipping, this is kind of the same thing, honestly, but the Ukrainians have actually done this incredibly well, honestly. You want long-range strike, which maybe doesn't come from an aircraft. Now, of course, from the Air Force's perspective, that's kind of the point. But, I mean, they've done incredibly well with just largely drones and land-based anti-ship missile batteries and artillery. They were using land-based artillery to fire on Snake Island in order to retake it. That's wild. So, yeah, generally, your coastal defense outside of the few patrol craft they do have active is going to be kind of your anti-ship batteries and artillery with some intelligence and maybe some extra fire from drones, which is what they've done to great effect with the Moskva and one or two of the transport ships that have been hit. So they've done this very well. In terms of maybe some support craft, a small fighter-type craft for refueling would make a lot more sense than a large refueling craft really high in the sky, especially since half of their type of airplane cannot reach the heights they would need to refuel with a big tanker. And then smaller AWACS or maybe some drone capability for intelligence would be very useful. They don't necessarily need, even the E2s might be a little big, but with a contested airspace like this, you don't want something that's really going to show up on radar. And really, the intelligence they've been getting from the US, the NATO, the UK, has been doing very well for them. So this kind of doctrine's what they're kind of rocking with right now, but I think kind of tinkering with that a little bit more with the Air Force and trying to coordinate a little bit more with the ground in order to make up some of those artillery deficits and doing limited air interdiction, I think will work to great effect, or at least the greatest effect they can in a very contested, pretty closed airspace. Which brings us to the F-16, the Falcon, or the Fighting Falcon, or most people call it the Viper. At least from my understanding, it's the pilots that usually call it the Viper, because I guess it just sounds cooler. The YF-17 and the YF-16 here, as you see, were part of the light fighter competition the Air Force did back in the 70s. They found that the F-4 was just a little bit too heavy and was getting outperformed by a lot of these smaller, more nimble Soviet craft, which, funny enough, their response to this was a large, fairly bulky craft with the Mig-29 and Su-27. So I guess, how the tables have turned. But the YF-16 was initially put forward by General Dynamics, which is now being produced by Lockheed Martin. And then the YF-17, which would go on to be the FA-18, was originally developed by Northrop. Ultimately, the F-16 or YF-16 would win out in this competition, but the Navy was like, hey, we'll take the second place one because we still need an aircraft, because the Tomcat was still really expensive at this point, and, well, it always was expensive. But yeah, this was a very light, very nimble craft that was designed pretty much for the role of air interdiction. Over the years, it would go on to fill out more of a multi-role situation, even going into like ground attack and some light air superiority stuff. But this thing is a dogfighter through and through. This is designed in a ton of ways to be more beneficial in a dogfight, even down to the angle of the seat and the canopy. As you see, the canopy doesn't have that bar in the front of the pilot, so it doesn't block any view. Their view is fully unimpeded in the cockpit, and their chair is tilted back at about 20 degrees to give them a little bit more visibility. And they also have their way they're set up is with their flight control stick and their throttle is on either side, not based in the middle. So it is also a little easier to handle from that aspect, from my understanding as well. Now, the current version, or at least the most prominent version right now, is the F-16C Block 50 and 52. There are reasons why there are two blocks. This dates back to the beginning of the aircraft for the most part, but currently the two blocks would be the difference in engines. So the Block 50 is going to use the General Electric F110 GE129 engine. This is designed more for a better performance at low altitude, as it generates lift through airflow. Your air is more abundant and thicker down lower, so you don't have to worry too much about like really thin air. You can generate lift off of that, which means a lot of these, from my understanding, once again, as some dude on the internet, are more your kind of lower altitude ground attack based craft, but they kind of mix and match a little bit in terms of roles. Then the Block 52 is the Pratt & Whitney F100 PW229. This generates lift via heat, so this has better high-altitude performance. Both are very comparable, to be honest, from my understanding of looking at different specs and looking at different pilot interviews. They handle roughly the same, just kind of where one gets the edge over the other. The blocks are not mixed in terms of flights, so everyone kind of in your squadron, from my understanding, is the same type of, it's the same blocks, 50 or 52. They don't mix them just because that gets a little weird and wonky, and capability would be all over the place. So there you get some of the weight capabilities as well. Once again, kind of getting on the heavier side of what we were seeing with the Russian stuff. Service ceiling, not quite as high as, like, say, the MiG-29, but still very high and very serviceable. At different altitudes, you have different speeds, but it can go up just above Mach 2. So very fast, kind of around where the MiG-29 was sitting, just a little bit slower, but it's much lighter, much more agile craft from a base level. Its combat radius is not quite as big. It's only about 399 miles. Once again, there's a whole host of things that can change that. But it does have the option to have 3 different fuel tanks, one center line and one on each side on the first pylon on the wings, which greatly extend that range. The service life can vary, but it's anywhere from 8 to 12,000 hours, and roughly about $8,800 for cost per flight hour. That can also be changed for a lot of reasons, and I've seen a lot of conflicting reports on why that may or may not be accurate, but generally that gives you roughly the idea of how much this thing is going to cost, which is actually pretty inexpensive in the grand scheme of things. They do field pretty much everything the USAF has to offer. So you have your air-to-air stuff. You have your AIM-9 series up to the AIM-9X here for high off-bore sight missiles for your close-range stuff. You have some Iris-T style missiles, as well as the AMRAAMs up to the D, if I'm correct. The most modern variant of it, I believe. Then you also have ground attack capabilities with the HARM, the Maverick, pretty much any rocket pods, guided or unguided bombs, and the Block 50 and 52 can also do Slammer ER, which are more of kind of a surface-to-air standoff munition. Then you also have anti-ship capabilities with the AGM-84 Harpoon and the AGM-119 Penguin, depending on which country and which missile you prefer, I suppose. And this is not necessarily as common of a role for the American F-16s, but there are other countries that use the anti-ship capability quite a bit more. Now, there are a lot of different F-16s, because this is probably one of the most exported aircraft the U.S. produces, and several countries have kind of their own variants. So the C and D, which are effectively the same craft, one just as a two-seater, whether for a weapons officer or training capability, roughly the same general capacity. So those are kind of your baseline, about $25 million per jet up front. Now, there's a lot of things that can change that as well. The F-16 is also kind of a custom-built type situation in a way. There are components that can be added, like the F-16E down there, which was the one, I believe, for the United Arab Emirates or the Saudis. It was one of the two, or maybe both, which has those two conformal fuel tanks there. You also have the F-16I, which is the Israeli variant, that also has the bigger center spine, which also houses some more ECM or electronic countermeasure stuff and electronic warfare suites. So it can be a very capable craft, but the more stuff you start stapling to it, the heavier and less nimble it gets. So your close-in dogfighting maybe is not as great as your base F-16Cs, but you have much further range without having to carry extra fuel tanks, or if you need to go real far, the extra fuel tanks, and then the electronic countermeasures. Stuff are also very important, And then you have kind of the weird one out here, which is the F2, which is the Japanese variant, which has its own designation because it's not technically an F-16. It looks a lot like one. You would be kind of surprised that it's not. It is based on the F-16 design, but it's called it was originally, I think, the Agile Falcon. It's about 20% bigger than the base F-16, but doesn't weigh that much more because the Japanese got a license right to produce their own, so it's technically a Mitsubishi aircraft. But it uses different components and different materials, so it's actually quite a bit lighter from just a base standpoint. But this is primarily used for anti-ship roles, as as Japan is an island. It's surrounded by water, so anti-ship capabilities are a lot more important to them. You kind of see there off to the side the F2 Kai or Super Kai, which was pitched by Lockheed Martin, I think back in like 2016, but the Japanese decided not to go for it and to wait for the F-35. That would adopt the conformal fuel tanks and some more of the electronic capabilities that the other variants had. But these, as you see, are a variety of costs. You go from like your fairly inexpensive $25 million per jet, with once again Lend-Lease and procurement packages. There's a whole different host of things that can change this, but these are kind of averages. To the I and the E being roughly like 60 to 70 million, to the F2 initially being about 60 million, but they haven't really gotten to export it, so we don't know how much that would be for an export deal. But there are a lot of different versions currently in service. There's kind of some picking and choosing of different parts that maybe would work for Ukraine, but generally, I think the most important thing is going to be budget for them, so the baseline F-16C would probably be more up their alley. So what are the good and the bad? It is truly a multi-role fighter. It carries pretty much everything that's designed for a fighter or strike craft in the USAF arsenal. Now, of course, it's not a strategic bomber. It's not doing the B-52, B-1, or B-2's job, but a lot of the more fighter-capable bombs and rocket systems absolutely 100%. Go on the F-16. They've been used on it for a long time. It's fast and it's agile, so your air interdiction, especially if it gets into a dogfight, you're probably going to have the edge over some of the larger Russian aircraft, even with their focus on super maneuverability. They're widely used, especially within NATO. There are, I think, like 5 or 6 different countries in Europe that use this. Poland uses them. Turkey uses them. Denmark, the Netherlands. There are a couple other countries that have used at least a few, maybe not like a huge fleet of them, but quite a few. The Japanese, of course, with their F2 variant. The Singaporean Air Force, and I think the Thailand Air Force, the Royal Thai Air Force? Thailand's Air Force uses them as well. Like I said, it's one of the most exported U.S. jets. There's a lot of countries that use these because they're fairly inexpensive. You can kind of add components as you need them. And, well, they're multi-role. They're very capable at doing most of their jobs, and they have one fairly good use depending on what block you're looking at. So you have some customization options that probably won't be there for the Ukrainians, at least at first, due to maybe some budgetary restraints in kind of how quickly they need them. But generally speaking, for the future, if they wanted to upgrade them, if they got them, they could do so, probably. One thing that has been a constant plague for the F-16 is to keep its weight down. Its landing gear is fairly weak. Now, this sounds like one of those things that people kind of complain about. It's like, oh, there's got a problem with this. And I'll fully acknowledge it's not a huge problem. But even in like 2021, 2022, there were 3, I guess within the last year, 3 different instances of gear breaking or not deploying. This wouldn't necessarily be a huge deal if it's not that Ukraine kind of needs those, if they have them and are trying to use them. And the Mig-29 has a lot more sturdy landing gear, especially for its design being focused around improvised runways. So, one, the F-16 cannot do that kind of improvised runway tactic. And 2, even on goodly, like solid, maintained airstrips, it has some issues. Once again, not widespread, but it's something that's been there pretty much since day one. There are a lot of logistical challenges that are going to come with this. Not only do you need supply lines for parts, there are extra considerations and arms that would need to go into this that the Ukrainians would need to have. Now, a lot of this is stuff that would pretty much be handled in the background without really anyone saying much of anything because, well, you don't want to tip the Russians off to say, hey, we're bringing arms for F-16s through this lane because, you know, they're just going to fire what they have of their ballistic missile stock. You, of course, have to have training for the pilots and maintenance crews. A lot of people get hung up on the pilot one, which is fine because, you know, it's, depending on who you ask, going to take them a while, right? The Ukrainians say, hey, we can learn this in a couple of weeks. The USAF's like, it takes people in our program like a year and a half, right? I think it's 6 months in base training in terms of just like combat, air combat, with training planes like the T-38. Then you have 9 months on the F-16 or reversed, one of the two. Regardless, about a year and a half, or roughly, yeah, a little over a year, I guess. Not quite a half, but, you know, it's a year and a little bit of time. So them getting that down to a few weeks feels a little optimistic, we'll say. But I don't think that it would take them the full time either. You know, they're experienced pilots. This is a very different aircraft, but it's something I think they could get used to. Maintenance crews, on the other hand, these are very different aircraft. These are capable, they're very small, they're very nimble, very different than most of what the Ukrainian maintenance crews are used to. Once again, they could learn, but that's something they're going to have to be trained on and proficient with before really being able to field F-16s in Ukraine. They also use hydrazine as a backup power supply in case of emergency, and hydrazine is super flammable. So not only do you have to take extra safety precautions, you have to go through and outfit your airfields to be able to store hydrazine in a safe way. Because with it being super flammable, if it gets hit on the ground, it's not going to look good. So you need to make sure you can safely maintain it in a contained area. It's hard to say in repetition. Now, technically, the Block 50 and 52 do have the capability for Slammer ER, which is kind of that standoff surface-to-air munition, or air-to-surface munition. Got that backwards. So this isn't necessarily as big of a deal, but if they go with anything pre-Block 52, which is pretty much nothing, unless the U.S. starts pulling mothballed planes and kind of repairing them and stuff, but I think they would probably add to that capability if they were going to do it. So that's kind of an out there one. It's a possibility. It would be useful for the Ukrainians, but it's not something that they may have off of the bat, depending on how these F-16s are procured. Now, that leads us to part 2, so be sure to check that video. I'll try to remember to put it somewhere here in the video or in the video description, where I'll talk about some of the other options that exist out there in the world and how they compare to the F-16, and maybe if they would be a little bit better for Ukraine. Anyway, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.